Rain drifted over the plains of Mohács like a warning no one wished to hear. Dawn should have brought calm light, but instead the sky looked bruised, swollen with the weight of an empire ready to strike. On the southern horizon, the Ottoman host spread across the land in silent, terrifying order, 60,000 soldiers arranged with the precision of a machine built for conquest. What stood before them was a kingdom on the edge of collapse. Hungary's young king, Louis II, barely 20, rode across the muddy fields searching for confidence he no longer possessed. His armour gleamed, but the men behind him were exhausted nobles, fragmented levies, and veteran bands who had marched too far, too fast. They knew what was coming. They felt it in the ground. The empire pressing toward them wasn't just larger, its tactics had evolved far beyond medieval Europe's fading rhythms. To the Hungarians, this battlefield was supposed to be a last stand. To the Ottomans, it was simply the next step in a long, inevitable expansion. Through the haze, the first shapes appeared: janissaries in disciplined ranks, Sipehi cavalry waiting like coiled steel, and behind them the cannons dragged into position with chilling purpose. Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent had not crossed half a continent to negotiate. He had come to erase a kingdom that had stood as a shield for centuries. The Hungarian commanders felt the trap closing, yet there was no path left but forward. Retreat meant surrender. Delay meant encirclement. Louis II pushed his horse ahead, trying to steady men who understood this battle might be the end of their world. When the first Ottoman guns fired, the sound rolled across the field like the crack of a continent splitting open. Hungarian lines shuddered. Nobles lowered their lances. Infantry pressed their shields together in desperate resolve. The moment the armies collided, the future of Central Europe shifted. Scattered formations, splintered defences, cavalry charges swallowed by trenches hidden in the grass. Ottoman firepower tore through armoured knights who still fought as their grandfathers had. The field became a maze of smoke and broken bodies as unit after unit buckled under an onslaught designed to crush nations, not just armies. Hours later, rain mixed with blood in the ruts of the battlefield. The Hungarian centre collapsed. Commanders fell one after another, and somewhere in the chaos, King Louis II was thrown from his horse into a flooded ravine, never to rise again. A kingdom did not simply lose a battle that afternoon. It lost its monarch, its army, and the last barrier that had sheltered Europe from the full weight of the Ottoman advance. August 29th, 1526 would be remembered not for victory or valour, but for the quiet moment the map of Europe began to unravel, starting with the erasure of a kingdom that had stood for 1,000 years. The shock of Mohács would haunt every decision that followed, pulling neighbouring powers into a struggle that would reshape empires and redraw borders for generations. By the early 16th century, the Kingdom of Hungary, once hailed as the unyielding shield of Europe, stood on fragile foundations. Its formidable mantle of defence, forged under King Matthias Corvinus, had begun to crack. The Black Army, a professional mercenary force that once matched Ottoman discipline blow for blow, had dissolved. Taxes that funded the army were abolished, castles fell into disrepair, and the nobility, protective of their own power, ignored royal commands. When Vladislas II ascended the throne in 1490, his pliancy pleased the magnates but weakened the state. Royal estates were handed out, the bureaucracy dismantled, and the central treasury emptied. Hungary's defensive network along the southern borders decayed, leaving gaping vulnerabilities in the path of a rising Ottoman tide. By 1521, the fall of Belgrade signalled that the strategic heart of Hungary was exposed. The southern fortress line, once a bulwark against Ottoman expansion, had been reduced to ruins, the weight of history pressing on an unprepared kingdom. King Louis II, a child monarch, inherited not a throne but a series of crises. Internal feuds paralysed the Diet, while the European powers, distracted, fractious or indifferent, offered only token aid. Austria's Archduke Ferdinand, embroiled in local revolts, could spare little. The papacy sent mercenaries and funds, but nothing to counterbalance Suleiman's growing momentum. Even France, once an ally, had secretly aligned with the Ottomans, ensuring that no Western European power would intervene. Diplomatic isolation, institutional decay, and the failure of the Corvinian legacy had left Hungary teetering on the edge. Within this vacuum, the Ottoman threat loomed like a storm over the Pannonian plain. Hungary's once proud armies, reduced to hastily raised levies, were no match for a professional modernized force. The stage was set, not for a clash between equals, but for the collapse of a kingdom that had long served as Europe's northern shield. The decisions, or indecisions, of the Hungarian elite would carry the weight of an entire realm into the chaos that was about to unfold. The echoes of this decline would shape the battlefield at Mohács, where centuries of political missteps and military erosion would meet the relentless advance of Suleiman's army. The death of Matthias Corvinus in 1490 left a vacuum that rippled through every corner of Hungary. His centralized authority, built on a powerful standing army and a rigorous bureaucracy, vanished almost overnight. The Black Army, a force of disciplined mercenaries armed with heavy cavalry, arquebusiers, and pavie-shielded infantry, once the pride of Europe, was dismantled as unpaid and abandoned men drifted from the ranks. Nobles, once restrained by a strong king, seized control. The tax base that funded both army and administration was gutted. Fortresses decayed, border guards went unpaid, and defensive initiatives were crushed beneath the weight of aristocratic self-interest. The Corvinian state, which had projected Hungarian influence deep into the Balkans and restrained Ottoman ambitions for decades, was reduced to a hollow shell. This dismantling was not merely administrative, it reshaped the very character of Hungarian warfare. The professional soldiers who had disciplined the field were replaced by antiquated feudal levies. Noble banderiums, raised from private estates, could not match the training or coordination of the Black Army. Where once Hungary had relied on precise maneuvers and coordinated firepower, it now depended on the raw bravery of knights and local militias. By the time Louis II took the throne, the kingdom faced a stark reality. The institutional machinery that had once protected it was gone. The stage was set for vulnerability, for miscalculation, and for the rise of an enemy that had spent decades perfecting the very warfare Hungary could no longer withstand. This collapse of centralized power, the erosion of military professionalism, and the hollowing of the royal authority would converge tragically on the plains of Mohács, where decades of decay met Suleiman's relentless advance. When Louis II ascended the throne in 1516, he inherited more than a crown. He inherited a kingdom teetering on the edge of collapse. A child king in a realm stripped of its professional army, with unpaid garrisons and crumbling fortresses, he became the living symbol of a weakened state. Royal authority was almost non-existent. The treasury, chronically insolvent, could barely maintain the southern defensive line, let alone fund new initiatives. Factionalism consumed the Hungarian diet. The court party, favouring the king's authority, clashed endlessly with the National Party, led by John Zápolya, a magnate with his own designs. Compromise proved impossible. Political paralysis slowed mobilization, delayed reinforcements, and fractured coordination at every level. While Hungary hesitated, the Ottoman threat grew sharper, their conquest of Belgrade in 1521 opening the road to the Pannonian Basin. Diplomatic isolation deepened the crisis. Appeals to the Holy Roman Empire, to the Pope, and even to France yielded little. Europe was distracted, Austria by internal revolt, the papacy by limited resources, and France by its own defeats, and secret alliances with the Ottomans. Hungary faced a choice between retreat or confrontation, with an enemy who now marched unopposed toward its heartland. The result was a kingdom divided, paralysed by indecision and internal strife. As the Ottoman armies pressed closer, Hungary's fragmented nobility and a young king's impotent court would be forced to confront a stark reality. The state that had once been the shield of Christendom was no longer capable of shielding itself. The seeds of catastrophic defeat had been sown, and Mohács would be the bitter harvest. Hungary's plight was not merely the result of internal weakness. Beyond its borders, Europe's fractured politics left it exposed. King Louis II's desperate pleas for aid were met with silence, half-hearted support, or outright betrayal. The Holy Roman Empire, distracted by peasant revolts and brewing religious upheaval, offered only limited assistance. The papacy dispatched a small contingent of mercenaries and financial aid, insufficient to counter the Ottoman threat. France, however, would strike the deepest blow, not with armies, but with diplomacy. Francis I, reeling from his defeat at Pavia in 1525, sought to weaken his Habsburg rival by aligning secretly with Suleiman. The result was a perilous entanglement. The Ottomans, now confident of Western inaction, could advance into Hungary without fear of a coordinated European response. Christendom's supposed shield had fractured, leaving the Pannonian plain exposed to an unstoppable force. Isolated, politically fractured, and facing an enemy emboldened by Western inaction, Hungary teetered on the brink. Every hesitation, every internal quarrel now carried the weight of impending annihilation. The stage was set, not merely for a battle, but for the erasure of a kingdom from the map of Europe. The sun had barely risen over Constantinople when Suleiman the Magnificent began his campaign. Tens of thousands of men stirred across the docks, their armour glinting, their banners snapping in the morning breeze. Behind them, hundreds of carts carried supplies, cannons and siege engines. An entire empire mobilized with meticulous precision. Nearly 100,000 troops, including janissaries, Sipahi cavalry, irregular akincis, and non-combatants, would traverse hundreds of kilometers across rivers, mountains and marshlands, all bound for the heart of Hungary. Rain had turned the Balkan roads into mud-choked trenches, yet Ottoman engineers laboured relentlessly, building bridges and corduroy roads to keep the army moving. The Drava River loomed as the first true test of this logistical feat. Without opposition, the Ottomans constructed a massive pontoon bridge in 5 days, each plank laid under the relentless supervision of Suleiman himself. Had the Hungarian forces contested this crossing, the campaign might have stalled indefinitely, but their indecision handed the empire free passage. Meanwhile, in the Hungarian camps at Tolna, confusion reigned. King Louis II and his council delayed, waiting for reinforcements that would never arrive in time. John Zapolya, commanding 10,000 to 15,000 troops in Transylvania, remained stalled by geography and the sluggish pace of feudal levies. Weeks passed, and the Ottoman war machine advanced relentlessly, its every movement synchronized, its every unit disciplined. The contrast could not have been starker. A professional centralized force, perfectly coordinated, against a fractured kingdom clinging to outdated systems of obligation and honour. By the year time Suleiman's army emerged onto the Hungarian plain, the stage was set. Every decision, every logistical triumph of the march, funneled into a single inevitability, the confrontation at Mohács. And as the distant dust clouds rose on the horizon, the Hungarian nobility remained paralysed, unaware that the fate of their kingdom was rushing toward them at the pace of a well-oiled empire. On the southern edge of the Pannonian plain, the Hungarian army stirred, but not with the precision or urgency their homeland demanded. King Louis II, barely 20, waited at Tolna for reinforcements that seemed perpetually just out of reach. Weeks stretched into a tense lull as the nobles, steeped in their own regional power, moved at their own pace, ignoring royal summons or negotiating delays. The looming shadow of Suleiman's advancing force cast every delay in stark, lethal relief. The critical absence was John Zápolyá, voivode of Transylvania. Commanding between 10,000 and 15,000 troops, he lingered near the southern Carpathians, guarding against a theoretical Ottoman flank. His forces could have altered the calculus entirely, yet miscommunication, political hesitation, and the sheer logistical burden of moving a feudal army slowed the response to a crawl. The royal council faced a brutal choice: retreat toward Buda and risk ceding southern Hungary to devastation, or stand and fight on the flat, open plains near Mohács. Pride, politics, and the ancient doctrine of heavy cavalry clashed with the reality of Ottoman numbers and firepower. By late August, the decision was made. The Hungarians would meet the Sultan head-on, trusting tradition over strategy, unaware that the land they chose would become a death trap. The distant thunder of Suleiman's cannons over the horizon was more than a warning. It was the herald of annihilation. The plains of Mohács stretched wide, flat and unforgiving under the early morning sun, a stage ready for a clash that would erase a kingdom from history. The Hungarian army, numbering around 25,000 to 28,000 men, formed a fragile line of defence. Heavy cavalry flanked the centre, where mercenary infantry and artillery stood, while a second line of reserve troops lingered behind, waiting for the battle to unfold. Across the field, the Ottoman army, disciplined, professional and vastly larger, extended like a living tide, 50 to 70,000 strong, supported by hundreds of cannons and tens of thousands of janissaries and Sipahi cavalry. The contrast could not have been starker. A medieval levy facing a modern gunpowder-era empire. The Hungarian heavy cavalry, armoured knights proud but tactically constrained, represented the last breath of chivalric warfare. Their infantry, a mixture of mercenaries and ecclesiastical levies, was brave but undergunned and vulnerable to the disciplined volleys of Ottoman muskets. Their artillery, numbering no more than 85 cannons, was vastly inferior in both range and firepower to the Ottoman park of 300 mobile chained guns. Every element of Hungary's force was built for a bygone era. The Ottomans embodied the future of early modern warfare. When the battle erupted in the early afternoon, the Hungarian army surged forward with ferocious determination. Archbishop Pál Tomori led the initial charge, driving into the Ottoman Rumelian line. For a fleeting moment, armoured knights pierced the front, scattering irregulars and sparking hope. But the Ottomans had orchestrated a calculated, feigned retreat. As Hungarian formations pressed deeper, they stumbled into the deadly core of janissaries and chained artillery. Muskets erupted, cannons thundered point-blank into the massed cavalry, and panic rippled through the ranks. Horses bolted, armour offered scant protection, and the charge collapsed beneath an invisible wall of fire. Encirclement followed swiftly. Akincis and Sipahi cavalry struck from hidden flanks, cutting down infantry left exposed. Marshes and the nearby Danube transformed the plain into a lethal trap. Thousands fell, slaughtered or drowned. The battlefield, once meant to showcase Hungary's proud knights, became a tomb for its kingdom's future. Amid the chaos, King Louis II sought escape, but the Seal Stream claimed him under the weight of full armour. His death was both literal and symbolic, the Jagiellonian dynasty extinguished in hours. Nobles, bishops and knights fell alongside him, leaving families and institutions shattered. Ottoman chroniclers marvelled that so small a force dared oppose them. 2 days later, Suleiman surveyed the aftermath. 2,000 captured nobles and knights were executed, eradicating Hungary's remaining military leadership. Buda lay undefended, its royal palace and the famed Bibliotheca Corviniana plundered. Yet Suleiman, calculating the wider European balance, ordered a strategic withdrawal. Hungary would survive as a vassal state, its independence crushed by terror, submission and political calculation. In hours, Hungary's army lay annihilated, its king dead and its capital looted. The kingdom teetered on collapse, its social, political and military structures fractured. Mohács was more than a battlefield. It was the pivot upon which Hungary would be cast into over a century of division, occupation and shadowed sovereignty. The little war followed. Hungary without a king, its crown contested, nobles warring in sporadic, brutal skirmishes. Cities like Buda and Pest became pawns in factional manoeuvring. Authority eroded relentlessly, and the seeds of the kingdom's ultimate partition took root. By the 1540s, Hungary was carved into three entities: Royal Hungary under Habsburg rule, a vassalized Transylvania under Ottoman influence, and the central plains directly absorbed into the Ottoman realm. Fortresses became foreign garrisons, rivers and hills, once strategic, turned into lines of occupation. The coherence of a sovereign kingdom was obliterated, and survival became the measure of loyalty. The echoes of Mohács reverberated across Europe. Chroniclers in Vienna, Istanbul and Krakow debated blame and heroism. In Hungary, the battle became legend, a cautionary tale of fractured leadership, delayed decisions, and the perils of isolation in an age of empires. Literature, folk songs, and historical treatises carried its shadow, embedding Mohács into the national consciousness as both tragedy and lesson, a kingdom erased, yet never forgotten.